Harry Potter stared at the parchment in his hands, reading Arthur Weasley's hurried scrawl for the third time. The great hall buzzed around him with the excitement of students preparing for the Yule Ball, but the words on the letter seemed to pull him away from all of it. "Urgent family matter," he murmured, tracing the ink with his finger. "Need you at the burrow immediately. Tell McGonagall it's ministry business." Ron looked up from his untouched breakfast, his face pale with anxiety. They'd been dreading this day for weeks, the Yule Ball, the dancing, the humiliation that was sure to follow. But this letter changed everything. "What kind of urgent family matter?" Ron asked, though his voice held a note of relief rather than concern. "Dad never writes about ministry business. Not to you, anyway." Harry folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his robes. Something about Arthur's handwriting seemed different this morning, more hurried than usual, as though he'd written it in the middle of something important. The man who normally took time to ask about Harry's studies and express concern for his well-being had managed only a few terse lines. "I don't know," Harry admitted, "but he wants me there today. Christmas Day." Around them, fourth-year students were discussing their dress robes and dance partners with varying degrees of enthusiasm and terror. Parvati Patil walked past their table, her eyes finding Harry's for just a moment before she looked away. He felt a twist of guilt in his stomach. He was supposed to take her to the ball tonight, had promised her a dance, had already endured McGonagall's stern lecture about the honor of representing Hogwarts. "You can't just leave," Ron said, but he didn't sound like he believed it. "The Yule Ball is tonight. You're a Triwizard champion. Everyone expects. I know what everyone expects." Harry's voice came out sharper than he intended. The weight of expectation had been pressing down on him for months now, ever since his name had emerged from the goblet of fire. Being expected to dance in front of hundreds of people felt almost as terrifying as facing the Hungarian horntail. He stood abruptly, the bench scraping against the stone floor. "I need to find McGonagall." The walk to the Transfiguration classroom felt longer than usual. Harry's footsteps echoed in the corridors, which were unusually quiet. Most students were either sleeping late or fussing over their appearance for the evening's festivities. The Christmas decorations that had seemed magical and welcoming just yesterday now felt almost mocking. Garland and tinsel couldn't make this feel like a real Christmas, not when he was about to abandon his responsibilities and disappoint everyone who believed in him. Professor McGonagall was in her office, grading essays with her usual stern precision. She looked up when Harry knocked, her square spectacles catching the morning light. "Mr. Potter, I trust you're not here to express last-minute concerns about the ball. The arrangements are final, and your participation is— I need to leave Hogwarts today." Harry held out Arthur's letter. "Mr. Weasley says it's ministry business." McGonagall's expression shifted as she read the parchment, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a long moment she said nothing, and Harry found himself studying her face for any hint of what she might be thinking. Finally, she set the letter down and removed her spectacles, cleaning them with unnecessary care. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Potter. The Yule Ball is one of the most important traditions of the Triwizard Tournament. Your absence will be noted, and not kindly, by our visiting schools." "I understand that, Professor. But if Mr. Weasley says it's urgent, Arthur Weasley is a good man, but his definition of urgent doesn't always align with mine." McGonagall replaced her spectacles and studied Harry with the same intensity she brought to examining a particularly challenging transfiguration. "However, I've learned to trust his judgment in matters concerning your welfare." Harry felt a flutter of unease. "My welfare? You may go, Mr. Potter. I'll make your excuses to the other champions and to Madame Maxime and Karkaroff. Miss Patil will be disappointed, but I suspect She'll find another partner easily enough. The permission felt hollow rather than liberating. Harry had expected more resistance, more questions. McGonagall's easy acquiescence made him wonder what she knew that he didn't. An hour later, Harry stood in the entrance hall with his hastily packed trunk, watching Ron fidget with his dress robes. The burgundy velvet looked even worse in daylight, and Ron kept tugging at the lace collar as though he could make it disappear through sheer force of will. "I still think you're mental," Ron said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Missing the Yule Ball to spend Christmas at the Burrow." "It's not like I wanted to go anyway," Harry replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. The idea of dancing with Cho Chang had been appealing, even if the reality of his clumsy footwork would have been embarrassing. "Yeah, well, try not to let Mum mother you to death before I get home tomorrow." The flu journey to the Burrow was mercifully brief, though Harry emerged from the fireplace covered in soot and coughing. The familiar chaos of the Weasley kitchen greeted him, pots clattering on their own, the wireless playing Christmas carols, and the warm smell of cinnamon and roasting meat that meant Molly Weasley was in full holiday preparations mode. "Harry, dear." Molly appeared almost instantly, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron before pulling him into one of her fierce hugs. "Oh, you look thin and pale. Are you eating properly at school?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Weasley." Harry's voice was muffled against her shoulder, but he found himself relaxing for the first time in weeks. There was something about Molly's fussing that made him feel genuinely cared for, rather than simply managed. Arthur emerged from the sitting room, his red hair more dishevelled than usual, and his expression unusually serious. "Harry, good. Thank you for coming on such short notice." "What's this about, Mr. Weasley? Your letter said it was urgent." Arthur and Molly exchanged a look that Harry couldn't quite interpret. It reminded him of the way the adults had whispered around him in the days after his parents' death, careful and protective, and slightly guilty. "Well," Arthur said slowly, "Bill's coming home for Christmas. He'll be here this evening, actually." Harry waited for more explanation, but none came. Molly had turned back to her cooking with unnecessary focus, and Arthur was studying his hands as though they held fascinating secrets. "That's nice," Harry said finally. "I'd like to meet him properly." "Oh, you'll like Bill," Molly said brightly, her voice carrying a forced cheer that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's very clever, works as a curse breaker for Gringotts, travels all over the world, breaking enchantments on old tombs and treasure vaults." "Dangerous work," Arthur added quietly, "requires a particular kind of expertise." Harry found himself wondering why that expertise might be relevant to him. But before he could ask, Molly was pressing a plate of mince pies into his hands and insisting he sit down before he collapsed from exhaustion. The familiar rhythm of her care washed over him, and for the moment he was content to let the questions wait. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, and the Burrow felt warm and safe in a way that Hogwarts, for all its magic, somehow didn't. Whatever had brought him here, Harry thought, it was better than fumbling through a waltz in front of half the wizarding world. The sound of apparition cracked through the evening air, just as Molly was pulling the Christmas pudding from the oven. Harry looked up from where he sat at the kitchen table, watching Ginny attempt to untangle a particularly stubborn bit of tinsel that had somehow wound itself around the back legs of her chair. Ron was sprawled in the chair beside him, complaining half-heartedly about missing the Yule Ball feast, though Harry suspected he was secretly relieved to be home. "That'll be Bill," Arthur said, rising from his armchair by the fire. There was something in his voice, anticipation mixed with apprehension, that made Harry pay closer attention. The kitchen door swung open, and Bill Weasley stepped inside, brushing snow from his travelling cloak. Harry's first impression was that Bill looked nothing like what he'd expected from a curse breaker. He was tall, certainly, with the characteristic red hair of his family, but where Harry had imagined someone gruff and weathered, Bill carried himself with an easy confidence that seemed more suited to a university professor than someone who spent his days breaking into ancient Egyptian tombs. His hair was longer than any of his brothers, pulled back in a ponytail that reached past his shoulders, and when he turned his head, Harry caught the glint of an earring, something that looked suspiciously like a fang. Despite these unconventional touches, there was nothing careless about his appearance. His travelling robes were well cut and practical, and when he hung them carefully on the hook by the door, Harry noticed the deliberate way he moved, as though he was constantly aware of his surroundings. "Mum," Bill said, opening his arms for one of Molly's crushing hugs. "Something smells incredible." "Oh, Bill, you're too thin," Molly fussed, stepping back to examine him with the critical eye she reserved for all her children. "Are you eating properly in Egypt? I worry about the food there, all that foreign cooking." "The food is fine, Mum. Better than fine, actually." Bill's voice carried a warmth that made Harry think of summer afternoons, despite the December cold that clung to his clothes. "You'd love the markets in Cairo. The spices alone would keep you busy for weeks." He turned then, and his eyes found Harry's across the kitchen. For just a moment, Bill's expression shifted. Not unfriendly, but suddenly intent, as though he was seeing something that surprised him. "And you must be Harry Potter," Bill said, crossing the kitchen with his hand extended. "I've heard quite a lot about you." Harry stood to shake Bill's hand, struck by the firmness of his grip and the way Bill's eyes seemed to linger on his face. Not in the usual way people stared at his scar, but as though he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Nice to meet you properly," Harry said. "I mean, I know we've met before, but—" "Briefly," Bill agreed. "At the World Cup, wasn't it? You were rather preoccupied with dodging bludgers and trying not to fall off your broom during the match." "That wasn't the match," Ron interjected with a grin. "That was just Harry being his usual disaster-prone self." "Ronald," Molly scolded, but there was no real heat in it. "Bill, sit down. Dinner's nearly ready, and I want to hear all about your work." As they settled around the scrubbed wooden table, Harry found himself studying Bill more carefully. There was something about the way he moved, economical, precise, that spoke of someone who worked with dangerous things on a regular basis. When Molly began serving the Christmas feast, Bill's eyes tracked the movement of serving spoons and platters with the same careful attention most people reserved for watching potentially explosive potions. "So," Arthur said, carving the turkey with more focus than the task required, "how are things in Egypt? Still working the tomb in the Valley of the Kings?" "Finished that one last month," Bill replied, accepting a plate piled high with turkey and roasted vegetables. "Nasty piece of work, actually. Took 3 weeks just to identify all the curses layered into the entrance ward stones." "What kind of curses?" Ginny asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. Bill considered this, chewing thoughtfully. "The usual protection curses, confusion charms, temporary blindness hexes, a rather creative spell that made anyone who touched the door without permission break out in boils shaped like hieroglyphs. But underneath all that, there were older things, darker things." Harry felt a prickle of unease at the way Bill's voice dropped when he mentioned the darker curses. "Older how?" "Magic changes over time," Bill explained, turning his attention to Harry. "The way wizards cast spells, the way we structure our enchantments, it evolves. Most of the curses we encounter in Egyptian tombs are maybe 3,000 years old, which means they were cast using techniques that are completely different from modern spell work." "Different how?" Harry found himself genuinely curious, despite the growing sense that this conversation was heading somewhere he wasn't sure he wanted to go. Well, take a simple protection charm. Today, if you wanted to ward a door, you'd probably use a standard unlocking charm with a password component, maybe tied to a specific magical signature. Clean, efficient, easy to modify if you need to change the parameters. Bill paused to take a sip of pumpkin juice, and Harry noticed that his hands, while clean, bore several small scars across the knuckles and palms. But 3,000 years ago, Egyptian wizards approached magic differently. They believed that spells should be layered, interconnected, self-sustaining. Instead of one protection charm, they might weave together 15 or 20 different enchantments, each one feeding power into the others, creating something that was much more than the sum of its parts. That sounds incredible, Hermione would have said, Harry thought. Out loud, he asked. But that would be nearly impossible to break, wouldn't it? Not impossible, Bill said, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he smiled. Not the warm, family smile he'd given his parents, but something sharper and more professional. Just requiring a very particular approach. You can't tackle that kind of spell work with brute force. You have to understand the connections, trace the flow of power from one enchantment to another, find the keystone curse that's holding the whole structure together. And then, Ron asked, though he looked like he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. Then you unravel it carefully, piece by piece, making sure not to trigger any of the fail-safes the original caster built into the system. Bill's expression grew more serious. Because if you make a mistake with something that complex, the backlash can kill you. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Molly was frowning at her plate, and Arthur had stopped carving entirely, his attention fixed on his eldest son. But enough about work, Bill said, his tone deliberately lightening. I want to hear about Hogwarts. 4th year, isn't it, Harry? And you're in the Tri-Wizard tournament. That must be exciting. Harry shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I didn't enter myself. My name just came out of the goblet. Interesting, Bill murmured. And once again, Harry felt that intent focus, as though Bill was examining him for something specific. That shouldn't be possible, should it? I mean, there were protections on that goblet. Age lines, authentication charms. That's what everyone keeps saying, Harry said, unable to keep a note of frustration out of his voice. But I didn't put my name in. I don't even know how someone else could have done it. Bill was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Harry's face. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, almost hesitant. Harry, he said slowly, this might sound like an odd question, but have you ever had any unusual experiences with magical artifacts? Objects that behaved strangely around you, or spells that didn't work quite the way they were supposed to? Harry felt his stomach drop. Why do you ask? It's just... Bill glanced at his father, then back at Harry. In my line of work, you develop a sense for magical disturbances, irregularities in the way power flows around objects or people. And sitting here, talking to you... He paused, as though trying to find the right words. There's something unusual about your magical signature. Something I've never encountered before. The kitchen had gone completely quiet. Even the wireless had stopped playing, as though the house itself was holding its breath. What kind of something? Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Bill leaned forward slightly, his expression gentle but serious. I'd like to examine you, if you'd be willing. Nothing invasive, just a simple diagnostic charm to get a better sense of what I'm sensing. It might help explain some of the strange things that have been happening to you. Harry looked around the table at the faces of the Weasley family, Arthur's carefully neutral expression, Molly's barely concealed worry, Ron's confusion, Ginny's wide-eyed concern, and Bill waiting patiently for an answer, his scarred hands folded calmly on the table. "What exactly would you be looking for?" Harry asked finally. "Magical interference," Bill said simply. "Enchantments or curses that might have been placed on you without your knowledge. The kind of thing that could affect how other spells interact with your magic. The kind of thing," Harry thought, that could explain why his name had come out of a goblet that was supposed to be tamper-proof. "All right," he said quietly. "What do I need to do?" They moved to the sitting room after dinner, where Bill cleared a space near the fireplace and asked Harry to sit in the worn armchair that usually belonged to Arthur. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting dancing shadows across the cluttered walls lined with Molly's collection of family photographs and Arthur's Muggle curiosities. "What exactly are you going to do?" Harry asked, settling into the chair and trying not to fidget. The leather was warm from the fire, but he felt cold anyway, as though the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. Bill knelt beside his travelling bag, removing several objects that Harry didn't recognize, a collection of what looked like smooth stones in various colors, a few twisted pieces of metal that might have been jewelry, and something that resembled a crystal prism but seemed to bend light in impossible directions. "These are diagnostic tools I use for examining cursed artifacts," Bill explained, arranging the objects on the small table Arthur usually reserved for his evening tea. "Each one is designed to detect different types of magical interference. The stones respond to various schools of magic: protection spells, compulsion charms, binding curses. The metal pieces were forged in Egypt 3,000 years ago. They're particularly sensitive to ancient magic. And this," he held up the crystal prism, "was a gift from a colleague who works with goblin-made artifacts. It can detect magical structures that are hidden or layered." Molly had taken up position on the sofa, her knitting needles clicking rapidly as she worked on what appeared to be another jumper. Harry suspected the knitting was more for her nerves than from any genuine desire to add to her children's wardrobes. "Is this going to hurt?" Harry asked, watching as Bill arranged the stones in a careful pattern around the chair. "It shouldn't," Bill said, his voice distracted as he focused on his preparations. "I'm not casting any spells on you directly. These tools will simply react to whatever magical signatures are already present. Think of it like holding up a mirror to see what's already there." He picked up one of the metal pieces, a twisted band that looked like it might once have been a bracelet, and held it a few inches from Harry's forehead. Immediately, the metal began to glow with a soft blue light. "Interesting," Bill murmured, moving the piece down to hover near Harry's chest. The glow intensified, shifting from blue to a deeper violet. "There's definitely something here. Something old." "How old?" Molly asked, her knitting needles pausing mid-stitch. "Very old. Pre-Roman, possibly. The magical signature has that layered quality I was telling you about at dinner. Multiple enchantments woven together in a way that modern wizards don't typically use." Bill set the metal piece aside and picked up one of the stones, a smooth black oval that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. When he held it near Harry, it began to pulse with a rhythm that reminded Harry uncomfortably of a heartbeat. "Bill," Molly said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made Harry look at her sharply. Her face had gone pale, and her hands had stopped moving entirely. "That stone only reacts to binding magic." "I know," Bill said grimly. He moved the stone in a slow pattern around Harry, forehead, chest, left arm, right arm, and each time the pulsing grew stronger. "It's not just one binding either. There are multiple layers here." Harry felt a crawling sensation along his skin, as though invisible spiders were walking across his arms and neck. What does that mean, exactly? Binding magic? Bill exchanged a look with his mother before answering. Binding spells are designed to restrict or redirect magical energy. They can be used for protection, like binding someone's magic to prevent them from accidentally harming themselves or others. But they can also be used for control, to limit what kinds of magic someone can perform, or to siphon power away for someone else's use. The black stone was pulsing so rapidly now that it looked like a strobe light in Bill's hands. He set it down carefully and picked up the crystal prism, holding it at arm's length and angling it so that the firelight passed through it. The effect was immediate and startling. Instead of casting rainbow patterns on the walls as Harry expected, the crystal projected what looked like a three-dimensional map made of light, hovering in the air between them. And there, at the center of the projection, was an outline that looked disturbingly like a human figure, presumably Harry himself. But the figure wasn't alone. Wrapped around it, layered on top of each other like chains, were threads of light in various colors. Some were thin as spider's silk, others thick as rope. They wound around the figure's head, chest, arms, and legs, creating a complex web that seemed to pulse and shift even as Harry watched. "Dear Merlin," Molly breathed, her knitting falling forgotten into her lap. Bill was staring at the projection with an expression Harry had never seen before. Professional fascination warring with genuine alarm. "I've never seen anything like this," he said slowly. I count at least 15 different binding patterns here. Maybe more. They're so tightly woven together that it's difficult to distinguish where one ends and another begins. 18, Harry said quietly, though he wasn't sure where the number came from. It had simply appeared in his mind, like a whisper from somewhere deep inside his consciousness. "There are 18. Both Bill and Molly turned to stare at him. "How do you know that?" Bill asked. "I don't know," Harry admitted. "I just know." Bill studied the projection more carefully, his eyes tracing the paths of light with the same intensity he might have brought to examining an ancient tomb. "You're right," he said finally. 18 distinct patterns. Some of them are so subtle I almost missed them. "What do they do?" Harry asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "That's difficult to determine without more detailed analysis," Bill said carefully. "But some of these patterns are definitely designed to limit magical expression. Others appear to be siphoning energy away from your core magical reserves. And these 3 here," he pointed to particularly thick threads that seemed to originate near Harry's scar. "These look like monitoring enchantments." "Monitoring?" Molly's voice had risen to a pitch that suggested she was fighting to keep calm. "Spells designed to track magical use, emotional states, even physical location," Bill explained. "They're often used by parents to keep tabs on young children who haven't learned to control their magic yet. But these are far more sophisticated than anything a concerned parent would use." Harry felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. "You're saying someone's been watching me?" "More than watching," Bill said grimly. "Someone has been actively managing your magical development since you were very young. Probably since you were a baby." The room fell silent, except for the soft crackling of the dying fire. Harry stared at the projection floating in the air. Those 18 threads of light wrapped around a figure that represented everything he thought he knew about himself. Each thread was a secret, a manipulation, a piece of his life that belonged to someone else. "Can you remove them?" he asked finally. Bill was quiet for a long moment, studying the magical map with the careful attention of someone trying to defuse a particularly complex, explosive device. "Possibly," he said at last. But not easily, and not safely. These bindings have been in place for years. They've become integrated into your magical system in ways that make them extremely dangerous to remove. Attempting to break them incorrectly could seriously damage your magical core, or worse. Worse how? Harry asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know. Magical core damage can be fatal, Bill said bluntly. If the bindings are removed too quickly or in the wrong order, the sudden release of suppressed magical energy could overwhelm your system entirely. Molly made a small, choked sound that might have been a sob. Who would do such a thing to a child? Someone with a great deal of magical knowledge and very specific goals, Bill said darkly. This level of binding work requires years of study and considerable skill. It's not the kind of magic you learn from textbooks. Harry found himself thinking about all the strange things that had happened to him over the years, the times his magic had acted unpredictably, the way certain spells seemed to work differently for him than for other students, the odd incidents that professors had dismissed as accidental magic, but that had never felt quite right. The Goblet of Fire, he said suddenly. Could these bindings have something to do with why my name came out of the goblet? Bill's expression grew even more serious. Absolutely. In fact, I'd say it's almost certain. Some of these monitoring enchantments appear to be designed to interact with external magical systems, like a tournament that selects its champions based on magical signatures. So someone wanted me in the tournament, Harry said slowly. Someone wanted you in a position where you'd be required to use large amounts of magic under controlled conditions, Bill corrected. The question is why. Harry stared at the projection, watching the 18 threads of light pulse and shift around the figure that represented his trapped magical potential. For 14 years, he'd believed that his magic was simply his own, difficult to control sometimes, prone to unexpected surges, but fundamentally his. Now he was learning that even that most basic part of himself had been shaped and constrained by someone else's will. What do we do now? He asked. Bill carefully dismissed the magical projection and began packing his diagnostic tools back into his traveling bag. Now, he said, we figure out who did this to you and why. Because until we understand the purpose behind these bindings, attempting to remove them would be like trying to defuse a bomb while blindfolded. He looked up at Harry, his expression grave but determined. But I promise you this, we will figure it out. And when we do, we'll find a way to set you free. Harry nodded, though he wasn't sure he entirely believed it was possible. 18 bindings, woven into his magic since childhood, created by someone with knowledge and skill far beyond anything he could imagine. It felt like trying to fight the ocean itself, but looking at Bill's scarred hands and remembering the confidence with which he'd spoken about breaking ancient Egyptian curses, Harry found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally found a problem that was actually solvable, even if the solution might be more dangerous than the curse itself. Ron and Ginny returned to the sitting room, just as Bill was packing away the last of his diagnostic tools, their faces flushed from helping with the washing up. Ron took one look at Harry's pale complexion and his mother's red-rimmed eyes, and stopped short. "What happened?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. "Harry, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse than a ghost," Harry said quietly, and found that his voice sounded strange and distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Ginny dropped into the chair nearest the fire, her brown eyes moving between Harry's face and her mother's obvious distress. "What did you find?" Bill straightened from his crouched position beside his traveling bag, his expression grim. "We need to talk to Dad before I explain everything. This is bigger than I initially thought." Arthur appeared in the doorway as though summoned, still wearing his Christmas jumper, but looking more serious than Harry had ever seen him. Molly sent word through the flue that I needed to come home immediately. What's wrong? Sit down, Dad, Bill said, gesturing to the sofa beside Molly. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. Arthur settled beside his wife, reaching automatically for her hand. The gesture was so natural, so unconsciously protective, that Harry felt a sharp pang of something that might have been envy. He'd never seen that kind of easy intimacy between adults, had no frame of reference for what it looked like when two people faced trouble as a united front. Harry has been cursed, Bill said without preamble. Not recently, and not by accident. Someone has placed a complex network of binding spells on his magical core, probably when he was an infant. The silence that followed was so complete that Harry could hear the wind moving through the trees outside and the soft settling sounds of the house around them. Arthur's face had gone very still, and when he spoke, his voice carried a careful control that reminded Harry uncomfortably of how adults had spoken around him in the days following his parents' death. How complex? Arthur asked. 18 separate binding patterns, layered and interconnected in ways I've never seen before, Bill replied. Some are designed to limit his magical expression, others to monitor his activities and emotional states. A few appear to be siphoning energy away from his core magical reserves. Ron made a strangled sound that might have been protest or disbelief. That's impossible. You can't just curse someone like that without them knowing. You can if they're young enough, Bill said grimly. Infant magical cores are particularly malleable, especially in cases where the child has experienced significant trauma. The bindings would have been integrated into Harry's developing magical system gradually, becoming part of his normal magical signature. Who would do such a thing? Arthur's voice was very quiet, but Harry could hear the anger underneath it. Not the explosive temper that Ron sometimes displayed, but something colder and more dangerous. Someone with considerable knowledge of advanced magical theory and a very specific agenda, Bill replied. This isn't amateur work, Dad. Creating this kind of binding network would require years of study and considerable magical power. We're talking about someone with the skill level of a master craftsman. Ginny had been listening with wide eyes, but now she leaned forward in her chair. But why? What would be the point? Control, Molly said, quietly, and there was something in her voice that made everyone turn to look at her. Someone wanted to control Harry's magical development. More than that, Bill added. Some of these binding patterns are designed to interact with external magical systems. Someone has been preparing Harry for something specific, something that would require him to use large amounts of magic under controlled conditions. Harry felt the pieces clicking together in his mind with horrible clarity. The Tri-Wizard Tournament. Almost certainly, Bill confirmed. The magical signature alterations caused by these bindings would explain how your name could have emerged from the Goblet of Fire, despite the age restrictions and authentication charms. Arthur was staring at his hands, his jaw working as though he was fighting to keep his temper under control. This means someone has been planning this for years, since before Harry even started at Hogwarts. Since before I was even old enough to know what magic was, Harry said, and was surprised by the bitterness in his own voice. My whole life, someone's been pulling strings, making decisions about what I could and couldn't do. The room fell quiet again, and Harry found himself studying the faces around him, Ron's confusion and growing anger, Ginny's wide-eyed concern, Arthur's carefully controlled fury, Molly's protective anguish, and Bill's professional determination overlaying what looked like genuine affection. What does this mean for Harry now? Ron asked finally. Can you fix it? That's the complicated part, Bill said, running a hand through his long hair. These bindings have been in place for so long that they've become integrated into Harry's magical system. Attempting to remove them incorrectly could cause severe magical core damage, possibly even death. But you can remove them safely? Arthur asked. Possibly, Bill replied carefully. But not without understanding more about their purpose and construction. Some binding spells include fail-safes designed to trigger if the bound individual's magical signature changes too dramatically. Until I know exactly what we're dealing with, attempting removal would be like trying to defuse a bomb while blindfolded. Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. So I'm stuck like this? No, Bill said firmly. You're not stuck. But we need to be smart about how we proceed. I need to do more research, understand the specific type of binding magic that was used, identify the fail-safes and triggering mechanisms. It's going to take time. How much time? Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Weeks, possibly months, Bill admitted. This is the most complex curse work I've ever encountered, Harry. I won't risk your life by rushing. Molly made a soft sound that might have been approval or distress. What about Dumbledore? Surely he should know about this. Should he? Arthur asked quietly, and there was something in his tone that made everyone look at him sharply. What do you mean? Ron asked. Arthur was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dying fire. When he spoke, his voice was careful and measured. Dumbledore has been responsible for Harry's welfare since his parents died. If someone placed these bindings when Harry was an infant, and if they've been in place all this time without being detected, the implication hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. You think Dumbledore knows? Harry said. And it wasn't really a question. I think, Arthur said slowly, that we should be very careful about who we trust with this information until we understand more about the situation. Harry felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. For 4 years he'd trusted Dumbledore implicitly, had believed that the headmaster had his best interests at heart. The idea that Dumbledore might know about the bindings, might even have been involved in placing them, was almost too much to process. But Dumbledore's supposed to be on my side, he said weakly. He might be, Bill said gently. But until we know for certain, we can't risk revealing what we've discovered. If whoever placed these bindings realizes that we know about them, they might take steps to accelerate whatever they're planning. Or they might try to silence us, Arthur added grimly. Ginny had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now she spoke up, her voice steady despite her youth. So what do we do? We investigate, Bill said, carefully, quietly, without alerting anyone to what we've found. I'll research the specific magical techniques that were used, try to identify the original caster. Dad, can you use your ministry contacts to look into Harry's early placement with his relatives? Someone would have had to have access to Harry as an infant to place bindings this complex. I can be discreet, Arthur said, nodding. And Harry, Bill continued, turning to face him directly, you need to be careful. Try not to use large amounts of magic unless absolutely necessary, and pay attention to how you feel during and after spellcasting. If these bindings start to destabilize, you might experience unusual fatigue, headaches, or emotional volatility. More than usual, you mean? Harry asked, with weak attempt at humor. Yes, Bill said seriously. More than usual. Ron leaned forward in his chair. What about school? Harry's supposed to go back to Hogwarts in a few days. He should go back, Arthur said, after a moment's consideration. Acting normally is important. If Harry suddenly disappeared from school, people would ask questions we're not ready to answer. But the second task, Harry said, remembering. It's in February. If someone wanted me in the tournament to trigger these bindings, then we need to make sure you're prepared, Bill said. I'll come back before the task, examine you again, make sure the bindings are stable. If they show signs of destabilizing, we'll have to act quickly. Harry nodded, though the idea of returning to Hogwarts and pretending everything was normal felt almost impossible. How was he supposed to sit in Transfiguration class and take notes on advanced spell theory when he'd just learned that someone had been controlling his magic since infancy? "We're going to figure this out," Molly said suddenly, her voice fierce with maternal determination. "Whoever did this to you, Harry, they picked the wrong family to cross." Looking around the room at the faces of the Weasley family, angry, determined, and utterly committed to protecting him, Harry felt something he'd never experienced before. Not the grudging duty he'd sensed from the Dursleys, not the distant benevolence he'd felt from Dumbledore, but something warmer and more immediate. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was part of a family that was willing to fight for him, even if the fight ahead promised to be more dangerous than anything he'd faced before. Harry woke on Boxing Day to the sound of another apparition crack echoing through the burrow, followed immediately by Molly's delighted voice calling, "Charlie! Oh, my dear boy!" He lay in Ron's room for a moment, staring at the slanted ceiling and trying to convince himself that the events of the previous evening had been some sort of elaborate nightmare. But the hollow feeling in his chest and the strange, tingling sensation that seemed to run along his magical core told him otherwise. 18 binding spells. Someone had been controlling his magic since he was a baby. The smell of bacon and eggs drifted up from the kitchen, along with the sound of animated conversation and Molly's familiar fussing about whether her children were eating properly. Harry could hear Bill's voice, lower and more serious than the others, and a new voice that must belong to Charlie, warmer than Bill's, with a hint of roughness that spoke of someone who spent his time outdoors. Ron was still snoring softly in the bed across the room, his face peaceful in sleep. Harry envied him that peace. He doubted he'd ever sleep easily again, knowing what he now knew about himself. By the time Harry made his way downstairs, Charlie Weasley was seated at the kitchen table with a plate of eggs and bacon, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to Bill. Harry's first impression was that Charlie looked exactly like what he'd expected from someone who worked with dragons, stocky and muscular, with the same red hair as his brothers but shorter and more practical, and hands that bore the kinds of scars that came from working with dangerous magical creatures. "Harry!" Charlie looked up as he entered the kitchen, his face breaking into a grin that was warmer than Bill's professional demeanor, but carried the same underlying intelligence. "Good to finally meet you properly. I've heard quite a lot about you." "Most of it probably exaggerated," Harry said, accepting a plate from Molly and settling into the chair beside Ron, who had appeared shortly after him, still looking half asleep. "Actually," Charlie said, his expression growing more serious, "Bill was just telling me about your situation. I have to say, it's the most disturbing thing I've heard in years, and I work with creatures that can incinerate a person with a sneeze." Arthur looked up from his copy of the Daily Prophet. "What's your assessment, Charlie? Bill mentioned you might have a different perspective." Charlie pushed his empty plate aside and leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table. "The thing about working with dragons is that you learn a lot about magical bindings and control mechanisms. Dragons are incredibly powerful magical creatures, but they're also intelligent and proud. You can't just slap a standard restraining charm on a dragon and expect it to work. They'll break through simple magic within minutes." "So how do you control them?" Ginny asked, her eyes bright with curiosity, despite the early hour. "You don't control them exactly," Charlie explained. "You create what we call channeling frameworks, complex magical structures that redirect their natural impulses rather than suppressing them outright. It's the difference between damming a river and building channels to direct its flow. Harry felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying the bindings on me work like dragon control spells? I'm saying they work like the most sophisticated dragon control spells I've ever seen, Charlie replied grimly. The kind we use for the ancient dragons, the ones with centuries of magical knowledge and the power to level a small town if they chose to. Bill was staring at his brother with something approaching alarm. Charlie, that would mean that whoever designed these bindings expected Harry to become incredibly powerful, Charlie finished. Possibly more powerful than any wizard they'd encountered before. The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Harry found himself thinking about all the times his magic had surprised him with its intensity, turning his teacher's hair blue when he was angry, making glass disappear at the zoo, inflating his aunt like a balloon. He'd always assumed those incidents were just accidental magic, the kind that happened to all young wizards. But what if they'd been his true magical potential, breaking through the bindings for brief moments? There's something else, Charlie continued, his voice careful. The channeling frameworks we use on dragons include monitoring components, ways to track the creature's magical state and emotional condition, but they also include trigger mechanisms. What kind of triggers? Arthur asked quietly. Safety releases mostly, Charlie said. If a dragon becomes too stressed, or if its magical core shows signs of destabilizing, the framework automatically adjusts to prevent catastrophic magical discharge. But they can also be designed to respond to external stimuli, specific spells, magical signatures, even emotional states. Harry felt his mouth go dry. You think the bindings on me have triggers? I think it would be negligent not to include them, Charlie said bluntly. If someone went to the trouble of creating 18 separate binding patterns to control your magical development, they'd want safeguards to prevent you from breaking free accidentally. Bill had pulled out a piece of parchment and was sketching something with quick, precise strokes. That would explain why the tournament entry worked. If the bindings include triggers designed to respond to specific magical challenges, then entering Harry in the Triwizard Tournament might have been intended to activate something, Arthur finished, his face grim. Ron had been listening with growing agitation, and now he slammed his hand down on the table hard enough to make the plates jump. This is mental. Someone's been treating Harry like he's some kind of dangerous animal that needs to be controlled. More than that, Charlie said quietly. Someone's been preparing him for something. Dragon channeling frameworks aren't just about control, they're about preparation. We use them to train dragons for specific tasks, to ensure they can access their full magical potential when needed, while keeping them stable the rest of the time. What kind of tasks? Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Charlie and Bill exchanged a look that Harry didn't like at all. In our work, Charlie said carefully, we use channeling frameworks when we need dragons to access their most dangerous abilities. Flame intensity beyond their normal range, magical resistance to specific types of curses, enhanced physical strength for moving particularly heavy objects. Or, Bill added grimly, when we need them to survive exposure to dark magic that would normally be lethal. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Harry felt as though the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. You think someone's been preparing me to survive dark magic, he said slowly. I think, Charlie said, someone's been preparing you to either use dark magic or to survive prolonged exposure to it. The kind of magical conditioning we're talking about takes years to implement properly, and it's only necessary if you're planning to push a magical creature far beyond its normal capabilities. Molly had gone very pale, her hands clutching her knitting needles so tightly that her knuckles were white. Who would do such a thing to a child? Someone who needed Harry to be more powerful than any normal wizard could be, Bill said grimly. Someone who was planning for him to face something that would require every ounce of magical strength he could possibly possess. Arthur was staring at his hands, his expression troubled. "The prophecy," he said quietly. "There are rumors in the ministry about a prophecy concerning Harry and you-know-who." "What kind of prophecy?" Harry asked, his heart beginning to race. "I don't know the details," Arthur admitted, "but there's talk of a prediction made before you were born. Something about the only one who could defeat the Dark Lord." Harry felt the pieces clicking together in his mind with horrible clarity. So someone knew I'd have to fight Voldemort eventually, and they've been preparing me for it my entire life. "Possibly," Bill said, "but we still don't know who. The level of magical knowledge required for this kind of work is extraordinary. We're talking about someone with access to advanced magical theory, significant political influence to control your placement as a child, and detailed knowledge of whatever prophecy Arthur mentioned." "That's not a very long list," Charlie said grimly. "Most wizards with that combination of knowledge and power are either in Azkaban or sitting on the Wizengamot." "Or running Hogwarts," Ginny said quietly, and everyone turned to look at her. "We can't know for certain," Arthur said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Dumbledore has always claimed to have Harry's best interests at heart." "Has he?" Charlie asked bluntly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like someone's been treating Harry like a weapon to be forged rather than a person to be protected." Harry found himself thinking about all the times Dumbledore had seemed to know more than he was saying, all the meaningful looks and cryptic warnings, the way the headmaster always seemed to be several steps ahead of everyone else, as though he was following a plan that only he could see. "We need more information," Bill said finally. "Charlie, can you help me examine the binding patterns more thoroughly? Your experience with creature control frameworks might help us understand the trigger mechanisms." "Absolutely," Charlie replied. "When do you want to start?" "Now," Bill said grimly, "because if these bindings include the kind of triggers I think they do, Harry might be in more immediate danger than we realized." Harry looked around the table at the faces of the Weasley family, determined, protective, and increasingly worried. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been avoiding embarrassment at the Yule Ball. Now he was learning that his entire life had been shaped by someone else's agenda, that he might have been unconsciously prepared for a confrontation that could kill him. But looking at Charlie's scarred hands and Bill's professional confidence, listening to them discuss a magical theory with the easy familiarity of experts, Harry felt something that might have been hope. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, he was surrounded by people who understood the magic that had been used against him. People who might actually be able to help him fight back. Percy Weasley arrived at the burrow on the 28th of December with an armload of ministry files and an expression of barely contained outrage that reminded Harry forcefully of Hermione when someone questioned the accuracy of Hogwarts, a history. He'd apparently spent the better part of 2 days researching magical binding precedents in the ministry archives, and what he'd found had clearly disturbed his faith in proper governmental procedure. "This is unconscionable," Percy announced, dropping his files onto the kitchen table with a thump that made the teacups rattle. "The legal precedents for placing binding spells on a minor without parental consent are virtually non-existent, and those that do exist require approval from no fewer than 3 separate ministry departments." Harry watched from his position by the fire, as Percy began organizing his research with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to his prefect duties. At 18, Percy looked older than his years, his thinning hair and serious demeanor making him appear more like a career ministry official than someone who'd only graduated from Hogwarts a few months ago. "What did you find?" Bill asked, pulling up a chair beside his younger brother. "Legally speaking, the binding of a minor's magical core falls under 3 distinct categories of magical law," Percy began, consulting one of his files. "Protective bindings, which require parental consent and ministry oversight. Punitive bindings, which can only be imposed by the Wizengamot as part of a formal criminal sentence. And emergency bindings, which can be applied without consent only in cases where the individual poses an immediate threat to themselves or others." "And which category would Harry's bindings fall under?" Charlie asked. Percy's expression grew even more troubled. "None of them, technically. The complexity and permanence of what you've described would require authorizations that simply don't exist in our legal framework. Whoever placed these bindings either bypassed the ministry entirely or had access to powers that supersede normal magical law." Arthur leaned forward in his chair, his face grim. "What kind of powers?" "The Wizengamot could theoretically authorize such extensive binding work, but only as part of a formal trial and sentencing," Percy replied. "The only other legal precedent would be the Chief Warlock acting under emergency powers during a time of declared magical emergency." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Who was Chief Warlock when I was a baby?" Percy consulted another file. "Albus Dumbledore. He's held the position since 1980. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Harry found himself staring at his hands, trying to process the idea that Dumbledore, the man he'd trusted more than anyone else in the wizarding world, might have been responsible for the bindings that had controlled his entire life. "There has to be another explanation," Harry said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've been hoping the same thing," Percy admitted. "So I did some additional research into your placement with your relatives after your parents' death. The paperwork is unusual." "Unusual how?" Bill asked. Percy pulled out another file, this one considerably thicker than the others. "Standard orphan placement procedures require assessment by the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures to ensure the child won't be placed in a household with dangerous magical artifacts or creatures, and approval from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, which handles cases involving magical children in Muggle environments." "And," Charlie prompted, "neither department has any record of processing your case," Percy said to Harry. "Your placement was handled directly through the Chief Warlock's office, bypassing all normal oversight procedures." Harry felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "So Dumbledore personally arranged for me to live with the Dursleys." "More than that," Percy said grimly. "According to the files I was able to access, your placement was classified under the Fidelius Charm Protection Protocol. Your exact location was made a magical secret, known only to the Secret Keeper." "Who was the Secret Keeper?" Arthur asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Professor Dumbledore," Percy confirmed. The implications of this hit Harry like a physical blow. Not only had Dumbledore arranged his placement with relatives who despised magic, but he'd also ensured that no one else in the wizarding world could find him without Dumbledore's permission. For 10 years, Harry had been effectively hidden from everyone who might have taken an interest in his welfare. "There's more," Percy continued, his voice quiet. "I found references to something called the Potter Guardian Protocol in several related files, but the actual documents are classified at a level that's beyond my security clearance." "What does that mean?" Harry asked. "It means that whatever arrangements were made for your guardianship are considered so sensitive that only the highest levels of the Ministry have access to the details, Percy explained. We're talking about information that's restricted to the Minister himself, the Chief Warlock, and perhaps a handful of other senior officials. Bill was studying the files with the same intensity he brought to examining cursed artifacts. This level of secrecy suggests long-term planning. Someone didn't just make these decisions in the immediate aftermath of your parents' death. They prepared for this scenario in advance. How far in advance? Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Given the complexity of the legal framework that was put in place, I'd estimate months, possibly years of preparation, Percy replied. The kind of authorizations required for the Fidelius Protocol take considerable time to obtain, even for someone with Dumbledore's influence. Harry felt a surge of something that might have been anger or despair. So someone was planning what would happen to me before my parents were even dead. It appears that way, Percy said gently. I'm sorry, Harry. I know this must be difficult to hear. What about the prophecy? Charlie asked. Dad mentioned there were rumors about a prophecy concerning Harry. Could that explain the advance planning? Percy's expression grew even more troubled. I looked into that as well. There are references in several files to something called the Trelawney prediction. But again, the actual content is classified beyond my access level. What I can tell you is that it was made in 1980, shortly before your parents went into hiding. So someone knew what was coming, Harry said quietly. They knew my parents were going to die. They knew Voldemort would try to kill me, and they prepared accordingly. The evidence suggests that? Yes, Percy confirmed. Harry stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and shift as he tried to process what he'd learned. Everything he'd believed about his childhood, about the people who'd made decisions on his behalf, was turning out to be far more calculated and manipulative than he'd ever imagined. There's something else, Percy said after a moment. Something that concerns me greatly. What? Arthur asked. The Potter Guardian Protocol includes provisions for magical monitoring and intervention, Percy said, consulting his notes. According to the references I found, someone has been authorized to perform regular assessments of Harry's magical development and to take appropriate corrective action if deemed necessary. Corrective action like placing binding spells, Bill said grimly. Quite possibly, Percy agreed. The language is deliberately vague, but it certainly provides legal cover for the kind of magical intervention you've described. Harry felt something that might have been panic beginning to build in his chest. So not only did someone plan my entire childhood, but they've been actively monitoring and controlling my magic the entire time. And they have legal authorization to continue doing so, Percy added quietly. The room fell silent except for the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sound of Molly moving around in the kitchen, apparently unaware of the devastating conversation taking place in the sitting room. Harry found himself thinking about all the times he'd felt grateful for Dumbledore's guidance, all the moments when the headmaster's presence had made him feel safe and protected. How much of that safety had been real, and how much had been simply another form of control? What do we do with this information? Harry asked finally. We're very careful about who we share it with, Arthur said firmly. If these arrangements have legal backing, then challenging them could put you in considerable danger. More danger than I'm already in? Harry asked with bitter humor. Potentially, yes, Bill said seriously. If someone has gone to these lengths to control your magical development, they obviously have a specific plan in mind. Disrupting that plan before we understand its full scope could trigger protective measures we're not prepared for. Like the binding triggers Charlie mentioned, Harry said. Exactly, Charlie confirmed. If these bindings include fail-safes designed to activate if someone attempts to interfere with the original plan, challenging the legal framework could be the very thing that sets them off. Percy was gathering his files with obvious reluctance. I'll continue researching, see if I can find any additional information about the specific terms of the Guardian Protocol. But I have to be careful. Too many inquiries into classified material could draw unwanted attention. How much danger are you putting yourself in by helping us? Harry asked, suddenly concerned for Percy's safety. Less than you might think, Percy replied. I'm a junior assistant with legitimate research duties. As long as I'm careful about how I phrase my inquiries and don't try to access material that's obviously beyond my clearance level, I should be able to continue investigating without raising suspicions. Thank you, Harry said quietly. I know this isn't easy for you. Percy's expression softened slightly. Your family, Harry. What they've done to you is an unconscionable abuse of power, and I won't stand for it. As Percy gathered his materials and prepared to return to London, Harry found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. A week ago, he'd been worrying about the Triwizard Tournament and trying to figure out how to ask Cho Chang to the Yule Ball. Now he was learning that his entire existence had been shaped by forces he'd never suspected, that the very foundation of his identity had been built on manipulation and control. But looking around the burrow at the faces of the Weasley family, determined, protective, and absolutely committed to uncovering the truth, Harry felt something that might have been hope. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by people who were willing to question authority on his behalf, who valued his autonomy more than their own comfort or safety. Whatever came next, at least he wouldn't be facing it alone. Contacting Sirius proved more complicated than Harry had anticipated. Bill spent the better part of New Year's Eve working out a secure communication method that wouldn't risk exposing Sirius's location to Ministry detection, finally settling on a combination of flu powder and a complex redirecting charm that would make the magical signature untraceable. The face that appeared in the green flames of the burrow's fireplace shortly after midnight looked haggard and worn, but unmistakably relieved to see Harry alive and well. Sirius's black hair was longer than it had been during their brief meeting at the end of Harry's third year, and his grey eyes held a wariness that spoke of too many months spent looking over his shoulder. "Harry," Sirius said, his voice rough with emotion. When Arthur's message reached me, I thought, well, I wasn't sure what to think. You're supposed to be at Hogwarts. There's been a development, Bill said, positioning himself where Sirius could see him through the flames. Something that requires immediate attention from people who knew Harry's parents. Sirius's expression grew more alert. What kind of development? Bill launched into a concise explanation of their discoveries over the past week, his voice clinical and professional as he described the binding patterns, the legal research Percy had conducted, and the implications of Dumbledore's involvement. Throughout the recitation, Harry watched Sirius's face grow progressively more grim, his aristocratic features settling into lines of barely controlled fury. "Binding spells," Sirius said when Bill finished, his voice dangerously quiet. "Someone placed binding spells on James and Lily's son." 18 of them, Harry confirmed. "Bill thinks they've been controlling my magical development since I was a baby." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft crackling of the flue flames. When Sirius spoke again, his voice carried a cold rage that reminded Harry uncomfortably of the Black family's reputation for dark magic. "I'll kill him," Sirius said simply. "I'll find Dumbledore, and I'll tear his throat out with my bare hands." "Sirius," Harry said quickly, "we don't know for certain that Dumbledore—" "Don't we?" Sirius interrupted. Who else had access to you as an infant? Who else had the legal authority to make those kinds of arrangements? Who else has been making decisions about your life without consulting anyone who actually cares about your welfare? Before Harry could respond, another voice spoke from behind Sirius's image in the flames, calmer, more measured, but carrying its own undertone of barely restrained anger. "May I?" Sirius shifted slightly, and Remus Lupin's face appeared beside his in the fire. Harry felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension at seeing his former defense against the dark arts teacher. Remus looked tired, as he always did, his prematurely grey hair more silver than Harry remembered, and new scars visible along his jawline. "Professor Lupin," Harry said, unsure whether he should be glad to see him or worried about involving another person in their dangerous investigation. "Just Remus, please," Lupin said with a tired smile. "I haven't been your professor for some time now. Sirius has been telling me what Bill discovered. I have to say, it explains a great deal about the unusual magical signatures I've observed around you over the years." "You noticed something?" Bill asked, leaning forward with professional interest. "The lycanthrope condition makes one particularly sensitive to magical manipulation," Remus explained, his voice taking on the familiar cadence of a teacher. "Werewolves are subjected to various forms of magical control throughout our lives. Tracking spells, behavioral modification charms, mandatory registration enchantments. You develop an ability to recognize when someone's magical signature has been artificially altered." "And you sensed that in Harry?" Bill pressed. "From the moment I first met him on the Hogwarts Express," Remus confirmed. "His magical signature was layered, for lack of a better word. Like looking at a painting through several sheets of colored glass. The core power was clearly there, but it was being filtered through something else." Harry felt a chill run down his spine. "You knew something was wrong and you didn't say anything?" Remus's expression grew pained. "I suspected something unusual, but magical signatures can be affected by many things. Trauma, inherited curse damage, even particularly strong emotional blocks. I had no reason to suspect deliberate manipulation, and frankly, questioning Dumbledore's guardianship of you seemed—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Inadvisable, given my own precarious position in the wizarding community." "Because you're a werewolf," Harry said quietly. "Because I'm a werewolf who was already under suspicion for my connection to Sirius," Remus corrected. Raising questions about Harry Potter's magical condition would have been seen as an attempt to undermine Dumbledore's authority. The consequences would have been severe. Sirius made a sound that might have been a growl. "So you kept quiet while someone tortured my godson with binding spells." "I kept quiet because I had no proof and no power to act on my suspicions," Remus replied firmly. "But now that we have proof—" His voice trailed off, and when he continued, there was steel beneath the exhaustion. "Now we can do something about it." "What exactly can you do?" Bill asked. "Both of you are fugitives from Ministry justice, and Harry is still legally a minor under Dumbledore's guardianship." "There are ways around legal guardianship," Sirius said grimly. "Blood magic, for one. As Harry's godfather and the last surviving member of the Black family, I have certain traditional rights that supersede Ministry authority." "Blood magic is dangerous," Bill warned, "and it's heavily regulated." "So is placing 18 binding spells on a child," Sirius replied coldly. Remus leaned forward, his scarred face serious. "There's something else you need to know. Something about the connection between Harry's scar and the Dark Lord." Harry felt his stomach drop. "What about my scar?" "Werewolf senses extend beyond just magical signatures," Remus explained. We can detect spiritual disturbances, soul magic, the presence of foreign magical consciousness. Harry, when I was teaching at Hogwarts, there were times when I could sense something else around you. Something dark and angry and not entirely human. Voldemort, Harry said quietly. A piece of him, at the very least, Remus confirmed. The scar on your forehead isn't just a physical mark. It's a magical wound that never properly healed. And whatever bindings have been placed on you, some of them are specifically designed to interact with that wound. Bill had gone very still. You're saying the bindings are connected to Harry's connection with Voldemort? I'm saying that some of those binding patterns are designed to manage a very specific type of magical contamination, Remus replied. The kind that might result from prolonged exposure to soul magic or dark artifacts. Harry felt the room spinning around him. Are you telling me that part of Voldemort is inside my head? I'm telling you that the scar on your forehead contains magical residue from the night Voldemort tried to kill you, Remus said gently, and that someone has known about it for 14 years. The implications hit Harry like a physical blow. Not only had someone been controlling his magical development, but they'd been doing it to manage his connection to the darkest wizard in history. Every binding spell, every restriction on his power, every manipulation of his magical signature, it had all been designed to contain something that was part of Voldemort himself. That's why removing the bindings is so dangerous, Bill said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. If they're designed to contain dark magic contamination, removing them incorrectly could release whatever they've been holding back. Exactly, Remus confirmed. And if I'm right about the nature of that contamination, the consequences of a failed removal attempt could be catastrophic. Sirius was staring at Harry through the flames with an expression of anguish and fury. They turned you into a prison. They bound your magic not to protect you, but to contain the piece of Tom Riddle they left inside your head. How long have you suspected this? Harry asked Remus, his voice barely above a whisper. Years, Remus admitted. But suspecting and proving are very different things. And even if I'd had proof, what could I have done? Challenge the chief warlock of the Wizengamot on the basis of werewolf magical sensitivity? Demand that he explain his treatment of the boy who lived? You could have told me, Harry said, anger beginning to burn through his shock. You could have warned me that there might be something of Voldemort in my head. And what would you have done with that knowledge? Remus asked quietly. You were 13 years old, Harry. Learning that you carried a piece of the wizard who murdered your parents. What would that have accomplished except to give you nightmares? Harry wanted to argue, but he found himself thinking about how he'd reacted to learning about the bindings. The knowledge had been devastating enough when he was 14 and surrounded by people who could help him. At 13, alone and vulnerable, it might have destroyed him entirely. So what do we do now? He asked finally. We find a way to safely separate you from both the dark magic contamination and the bindings that have been containing it, Bill said. But we'll need more expertise than any of us possess. This isn't just curse breaking. It's magical surgery of the most delicate kind. There might be someone who can help, Remus said slowly. Someone with experience in both dark magic containment and advanced magical healing. But contacting her would be extremely dangerous. Who? Sirius asked. Your cousin Andromeda, Remus replied. She was one of the most talented witches of her generation before she was disowned for marrying a Muggle-born. Her specialty was medical magic, with a focus on curse damage. If anyone could understand the magical interactions we're dealing with, it would be her. Sirius was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant. Andromeda hasn't spoken to me since I was 16. After what the family did to her, I don't think she'd be inclined to help anyone with the black name. She might if she understood what was at stake, Remus said. And if she knew it was for James and Lily's son. Harry looked between the two faces in the fireplace. His godfather, angry and protective and dangerous in his desperation to help, and his former teacher, tired and scarred, but offering what hope he could. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Harry felt as though they might actually have a path forward. But looking at the fear in their eyes, he also understood that the path ahead would be more dangerous than anything he'd faced before, including dragons. The return journey to Hogwarts felt surreal, as though Harry was watching someone else's life unfold through a window. The familiar rhythm of the Hogwarts Express, the comfortable chaos of students returning from Christmas holidays, even Ron's animated complaints about Percy's newfound obsession with ministry paperwork. It all seemed to belong to a different world, one where 14-year-old boys worried about essays and Quidditch matches rather than soul magic and binding spells. Harry sat by the window of their compartment, watching the Scottish countryside roll past while Ron and Hermione caught up on their respective holiday activities. He'd rehearsed this conversation dozens of times during the train journey, trying to find the right words to explain what they'd discovered without completely devastating his best friend's faith in the adults who were supposed to protect them. "You're being unusually quiet," Hermione observed, looking up from the book she'd been reading. Something dense and academic about advanced transfiguration theory. Did something happen at the burrow? Harry exchanged a look with Ron, who had grown progressively more tense as they approached the conversation they both knew was inevitable. They'd agreed to tell Hermione everything, but actually doing it felt like setting off an explosive in the confined space of the train compartment. "Something happened," Harry said finally. "Something big." Hermione set her book aside immediately, her brown eyes sharp with concern. "What kind of something? You both look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse than a ghost," Ron muttered, echoing Harry's words from a week earlier. Harry took a deep breath and began to explain, starting with Bill's examination and working his way through the discoveries about binding spells, legal documents, and the horrifying revelation about his scar's connection to Voldemort. Throughout his recitation, he watched Hermione's expression shift from curiosity to alarm to outright horror. By the time he finished describing Remus's theory about the soul magic contamination, Hermione had gone very pale and was gripping the edge of her seat hard enough that her knuckles were white. 18 binding spells, she said slowly, as though testing the words. "Since you were a baby." "According to Bill and Charlie, yes," Harry confirmed. "And they think Dumbledore authorized them." "The legal evidence certainly points in that direction," Harry replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Hermione was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was very small. "Harry, this means your entire magical development has been artificially controlled. Every spell you've ever cast, every piece of accidental magic, every interaction you've had with magical objects, none of it has been truly yours." The words hit harder than Harry had expected, probably because they were spoken in Hermione's clinical, analytical tone. She had a way of stating facts that made them impossible to dismiss or minimize, and hearing her summarize his situation so starkly made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. "I know," he said quietly. "And you think part of Voldemort is actually inside your head?" "That's what Remus believes. Yes." Hermione made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been a laugh. "This is insane. This is completely, utterly insane." "Tell me about it," Ron said grimly. "What are we going to do?" Hermione asked, and Harry was struck by the automatic inclusion of herself in whatever came next. Despite the magnitude of what he'd just told her, her first instinct was to figure out how to help rather than to distance herself from the danger. Bill is working on finding someone who might be able to safely remove the bindings, Harry explained. But in the meantime, I have to act normal. Go to classes, prepare for the second task, pretend like nothing's changed. The second task, Hermione repeated, her eyes widening. Harry, if these bindings are designed to interact with external magical challenges, participating in the tournament could trigger them. Bill thought of that, Harry said. He's going to examine me again right before the task, make sure the bindings are stable. If they show signs of destabilizing, we'll figure out how to withdraw me from the competition. How? Hermione asked practically. The Goblet of Fire creates a magical contract. You can't just withdraw from a magically binding agreement. Harry felt his stomach drop. In all the discussions about binding spells and soul magic, they'd somehow overlooked the most immediate problem. He was still legally obligated to compete in a tournament that might kill him. There has to be a way, Ron said, but his voice lacked conviction. Not without breaking the magical contract, Hermione replied, and the consequences for that could be severe. Magical contracts aren't like Muggle legal agreements. They're enforced by the magic itself. So what are you saying? Harry asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I'm saying that whoever entered you in this tournament made sure you'd have to see it through to the end, Hermione said grimly, which means the second task isn't just an academic challenge anymore. It's potentially a triggering event for whatever they've been planning. The rest of the journey passed in tense silence, broken only by Hermione's occasional questions about the technical details of Bill's examination or the legal precedents Percy had uncovered. Harry found himself studying her familiar face, the bushy brown hair, the way she bit her lip when she was thinking, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, and wondering if this would be the last normal conversation they'd have before everything fell apart completely. Returning to Hogwarts felt like entering a stage set for a play he no longer wanted to perform in. The great hall looked the same, the house tables arranged in their familiar formation, the enchanted ceiling reflecting a clear winter night. But Harry found himself seeing it all through new eyes, wondering which of the professors knew about his condition, which of the adults he'd trusted were complicit in his manipulation. Dumbledore sat at the high table, his silver beard gleaming in the candlelight, his half-moon spectacles catching the reflection of the floating candles above. He looked exactly as he always had, wise, benevolent, utterly trustworthy. Harry stared at him and tried to reconcile the image of the kindly headmaster with the idea of someone who would authorize binding spells on an infant. "Harry," Hermione said quietly, following his gaze, "don't do anything stupid." "I'm not going to do anything," Harry replied, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Good," she said firmly, "because we need more information before we make any decisions, and we need to be smart about how we proceed." Over the next few days, Harry discovered that maintaining a facade of normalcy was exhausting in ways he hadn't anticipated. Sitting through Defense Against the Dark Arts with Mad-Eye Moody, who might or might not be the real Moody, depending on who you asked, felt like walking through a minefield. Every casual question from his professors, every concerned inquiry about his preparation for the second task, every friendly conversation with classmates carried the weight of secrets he couldn't share. The worst part was pretending to care about things that had once seemed important. Homework assignments felt trivial when he was carrying a piece of Voldemort in his head. Quidditch strategies seemed irrelevant when his entire magical identity had been constructed by someone else's agenda. Even his friendship with his classmates felt strained, as though he was watching them from behind glass. "You're not sleeping," Hermione observed one morning over breakfast, studying Harry's face with clinical concern. Hard to sleep when you're wondering if the Dark Lord is going to start whispering in your dreams, Harry replied, stabbing his eggs with unnecessary force. Has that happened? Ron asked, his voice sharp with alarm. No, Harry admitted, but Bill said the bindings might destabilize under stress, and I'm definitely stressed. Maybe that's why they're there, Hermione said thoughtfully. Not just to contain the soul magic, but to prevent Voldemort from accessing your mind. The idea was both comforting and terrifying. If the bindings were protecting him from Voldemort's influence, then removing them might leave him vulnerable in ways they hadn't considered. But if they were also controlling his magical development, then keeping them meant accepting a lifetime of artificial limitations. There's no good choice here, is there? Harry asked quietly. There's no safe choice, Hermione corrected. But that doesn't mean there's no right choice. 2 weeks into the term, Bill appeared at Hogwarts under the pretense of consulting with Professor McGonagall about career prospects in curse-breaking. The cover story was thin, but it provided an opportunity for him to examine Harry again without arousing suspicion. They met in an unused classroom on the 7th floor, the same space where Harry had once practiced Patronus charms with a very different set of concerns. Bill's diagnostic tools seemed almost mundane in the familiar setting of desks and blackboards, but the magical map they projected was just as disturbing as it had been at the burrow. The bindings are holding stable, Bill reported, studying the threads of light that wrapped around Harry's projected form. But I can see signs of stress in some of the deeper patterns. The monitoring enchantments are more active than they were a month ago. What does that mean? Harry asked. It means someone is paying closer attention to your magical state than usual, Bill said grimly, probably in preparation for the second task. So they're planning something. They're definitely planning something, Bill confirmed. The question is whether we can figure out what it is before the task takes place. Harry stared at the projection, at the complex web of spells that had shaped his entire life, and felt a familiar surge of anger. Not the explosive rage that had sometimes overwhelmed him in the past, but something colder and more determined. What if we don't try to figure out their plan? He asked suddenly. Bill looked at him sharply. What do you mean? What if we make our own plan instead? Harry said, his voice growing stronger. What if we stop reacting to what they're doing and start acting on our own? Harry, Bill said carefully, that could be extremely dangerous. More dangerous than sitting here waiting for them to spring whatever trap they've been setting for 14 years? Harry asked. More dangerous than participating in tasks designed to trigger magical responses they can monitor and control? Bill was quiet for a long moment, studying both Harry and the magical projection with equal intensity. What did you have in mind? He asked finally. Harry smiled, and for the first time since returning to Hogwarts, he felt like himself again. I want to learn how to fight back. The morning of February 24th dawned grey and cold, with a bitter wind whipping across the Black Lake that made Harry's scar ache in ways he'd never experienced before. He stood on the wooden platform that had been constructed for the second task, watching the dark water churn beneath the cloudy sky, and wondered if this was what it felt like to walk voluntarily into a trap. You look terrible, Hermione said quietly, appearing at his elbow with a steaming cup of tea. When did you last sleep? Tuesday, Harry replied, accepting the cup gratefully. The warmth helped steady his hands, which had been shaking since he'd woken up at 4 a.m, with the distinct sensation that someone was watching him. Harry, that was 3 days ago, Ron said, his voice sharp with concern. I know. Harry took a sip of tea and tried to focus on the familiar comfort of his friend's presence, rather than the growing certainty that something was very wrong with his magical signature today. The bindings felt different this morning, more active somehow, as though they were preparing for something. Bill examined me again yesterday. The monitoring enchantments are practically buzzing with activity. Did he say why? Hermione asked. He thinks whoever placed the bindings is paying very close attention today, Harry said grimly, probably waiting to see how I perform under controlled magical stress. The other champions were already preparing for the task. Fleur Delacour pacing near the judge's platform with the focused intensity of someone running through spell sequences in her head. Victor Crumb stretching like an athlete preparing for a physical challenge. And Cedric Diggory sitting quietly with his eyes closed, apparently meditating. Harry envied their ability to focus on the task itself rather than on the invisible magical manipulation that surrounded it. Every spell he'd cast in preparation had felt strange and muted, as though he was performing magic through several layers of interference. Bill had warned him that the bindings might affect his magical performance as they became more active, but experiencing it firsthand was deeply unsettling. Harry Potter, McGonagall's voice carried across the platform. If you would join the other champions, please. Harry handed his teacup back to Hermione and made his way toward the judge's platform, where Dumbledore stood with Madame Maxime, Karkaroff, and Bagman. The headmaster's eyes found his immediately, and for just a moment Harry felt the familiar sensation of being examined by someone who knew far more than they were saying. But this time, instead of finding comfort in Dumbledore's attention, Harry felt exposed and vulnerable. Did Dumbledore know about the bindings because he'd placed them there? Was he monitoring Harry's magical state even now, watching for signs that his carefully constructed control system was working as intended? The second task will begin in 10 minutes, Bagman announced, his voice magically amplified to reach the gathered crowd of students and visiting officials. Champions will have 1 hour to retrieve their treasure from the depths of the Black Lake. The use of magical breathing apparatus is permitted, but each champion must rely on their own magical abilities to locate and rescue what has been taken from them. Harry's stomach dropped as the full implications of Bagman's words sank in. Something had been taken from him. Someone, almost certainly, given the nature of the first task's emotional manipulation. The organizers had taken someone important to him and placed them in danger to force him into a situation where he'd have to use significant amounts of magic under time pressure. It was exactly the kind of scenario that Bill had warned might trigger the bindings. "Who do you think they took?" Ron asked quietly, his face pale with sudden understanding. "Probably you or Hermione," Harry replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Maybe both." "Then you have to get us back," Hermione said firmly. "Whatever the bindings do, whatever happens to your magic, you have to complete the task." Harry nodded, though his heart was racing. The idea of diving into the lake while his magical core was being actively monitored and manipulated felt like walking into a carefully orchestrated experiment. But the alternative, leaving his friends trapped underwater because he was afraid of what his magic might reveal, was unthinkable. "Champions, take your positions at the edge of the platform," McGonagall called. Harry moved to his designated spot, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes watching from the stands. Students, professors, ministry officials, foreign dignitaries, all of them expecting to see the famous Harry Potter demonstrate the magical prowess that had made him a legend. If only they knew that his magical prowess had been artificially controlled since infancy. Dumbledore stepped forward, raising his wand. "Champions, on the sound of the whistle you may begin. You have 1 hour." The whistle's sharp note cut through the morning air, and Harry dove into the Black Lake without hesitation. The water was shockingly cold, driving the breath from his lungs and making his scar flare with sudden pain. But as he sank beneath the surface, something strange happened to his magic. The bindings, which had felt constrictive and interfering all morning, suddenly seemed to stabilize. The muted sensation that had plagued his spellwork for weeks cleared, leaving him with access to magical power that felt more natural than anything he'd experienced in months. It was as though diving into the lake had triggered some kind of release mechanism in the binding network. Harry cast the bubblehead charm with an ease that startled him, the spell forming perfectly on his first attempt. The magical energy flowed through him smoothly, without the strange resistance he'd grown accustomed to. For a moment, he wondered if this was what his magic was supposed to feel like, clean and powerful, and completely under his control. Then he remembered that someone was probably monitoring every spell he cast, and the sense of freedom turned sour. The lake was murky and dark, filled with strange currents that seemed to pull him in different directions. Harry swam deeper, following the faint magical signature that he hoped would lead him to whatever had been taken from him. Schools of fish scattered as he passed, and he caught glimpses of larger shapes moving in the depths, creatures that belonged to the lake's ecosystem and had no interest in the human drama playing out above them. It took him nearly 30 minutes to locate the Mare Village, a cluster of crude stone buildings nestled in a depression on the lake floor. Merpeople swam in lazy circles around 4 figures suspended in the water by magical sleep charms. Ron, Hermione, a young girl who looked like Fleur Delacour, and someone Harry didn't recognize, but who might have belonged to Crumb. Seeing Ron and Hermione floating unconsciously in the dark water, their faces peaceful but utterly vulnerable, filled Harry with a rage that was entirely his own. Someone had taken his friends and used them as bait to force him into a magical performance. Someone had turned the people he cared about into props in whatever experiment they were conducting on his binding-controlled magic. The Merchieftain approached, speaking in the harsh, incomprehensible language of the Merpeople. Harry couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. He could take one person, and one person only. Harry looked at Ron and Hermione, both equally important to him, both equally innocent victims of this manipulation, and made a decision that had nothing to do with the rules of the task and everything to do with refusing to play along with someone else's game. He cast a modified severing charm on both sets of bonds, freeing Ron and Hermione simultaneously. The spell required more magical power than he'd ever accessed before, but with the bindings in their current state, the energy flowed through him like water through a broken dam. The Merchieftain protested angrily, but Harry was already swimming upward with his unconscious friends, pushing himself harder than he ever had before. The magical effort should have exhausted him, but instead he felt energized, as though the bindings were actually enhancing his abilities rather than limiting them. Which was, he realized with growing alarm, probably exactly what they were designed to do. By the time Harry broke the surface of the lake with Ron and Hermione, he was beginning to understand the true horror of what had been done to him. The bindings weren't just controlling his magical development, they were conditioning him for moments exactly like this one, when he would need to access power beyond his normal capabilities. Someone had been preparing him his entire life to be a weapon. "Harry!" Hermione gasped as the sleep charm wore off, her eyes immediately scanning the scene around them with characteristic alertness. "What happened? How long were we unconscious?" "About 45 minutes, Harry replied, helping her and Ron stay afloat as they treaded water near the platform. "They used you as bait for the second task." "Bloody hell!" Ron sputtered, spitting out lake water. "I'm going to have words with whoever thought kidnapping us was a brilliant idea for a school competition." As they swam toward the platform, Harry caught sight of Dumbledore watching from the judges' area. The headmaster's expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes that looked almost like satisfaction. Harry felt his newfound magical strength surge again, and this time it was fueled by anger that was entirely his own. Whatever Dumbledore was planning, whatever the bindings were designed to accomplish, Harry was done being a passive participant in his own manipulation. "Hermione," he said quietly as they reached the platform ladder, "I need you to research everything you can find about magical conditioning and combat preparation, specifically the kind of magical enhancement that might be used to create super soldiers." "Super soldiers?" Hermione's voice was sharp with alarm. "I think," Harry said grimly, hauling himself out of the lake with magic-enhanced strength that should have been impossible for a 14-year-old wizard, "someone's been preparing me to fight a war." The judges announced his score, full marks for rescuing both hostages, but Harry barely heard them. He was too busy watching Dumbledore's face and wondering how long the man he'd trusted most had been planning to turn him into a weapon, and whether the bindings had just made him powerful enough to fight back. Bill Weasley arrived at Hogwarts on the first Tuesday of March without an appointment, striding through the main gates with the purposeful intensity of someone who had run out of patience for diplomatic niceties. Harry watched from the Transfiguration classroom window as Bill approached the castle, his long red hair whipping behind him in the wind and his travelling cloak billowing dramatically. "That doesn't look like a social visit," Hermione observed, following Harry's gaze. "It's not," Harry said grimly. "After what happened during the second task, Bill's been trying to get a meeting with Dumbledore for weeks. I think he's decided to stop asking for permission." The enhanced magical abilities Harry had demonstrated during the task had confirmed Bill's worst fears about the true purpose of the binding spells. Instead of limiting Harry's power, they were conditioning it, preparing him for magical performances that would be impossible for a normal 14-year-old wizard. The implications were terrifying enough that Bill had apparently decided direct confrontation was preferable to continued investigation. "Students, please continue your reading," McGonagall announced from the front of the classroom, though Harry noticed her own attention was fixed on the approaching figure of Bill Weasley. "I'll return momentarily." She left the classroom with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements, but Harry caught a glimpse of something that might have been concern in her usually composed expression. "Do you think she knows?" Ron asked quietly. "I think she's about to find out," Harry replied. 20 minutes later, a first-year Gryffindor appeared in the doorway with a message that Harry Potter was requested in the headmaster's office immediately. The classroom fell silent as Harry gathered his books, every student aware that being summoned to see Dumbledore was rarely a routine matter. The walk to the headmaster's office felt longer than usual, each step echoing in the corridors with an ominous finality. When Harry spoke the password, "Fizzing Whizbees," and stepped onto the spiral staircase, he could already hear raised voices from above. The door to Dumbledore's office stood slightly ajar, revealing a scene of barely controlled conflict that Harry had never witnessed before. Bill stood near the center of the circular room, his posture rigid with anger, while Dumbledore sat behind his desk with his fingers steepled and his expression carefully neutral. McGonagall occupied one of the chairs in front of the desk, her square spectacles reflecting the afternoon light, and Snape loomed near the bookshelves like a black-robed spectre. "Ah, Harry," Dumbledore said, as Harry entered, his voice carrying its usual warmth despite the obvious tension in the room. "Please take a seat. Mr. Weasley has raised some concerns about your welfare that I believe you should hear directly." Bill turned to face Harry, and his expression softened slightly. "Harry, I want you to know that everything I'm about to discuss has been thoroughly researched and verified. We have documentary evidence for every claim." "Documented evidence of what, exactly?" Snape asked, his voice carrying its familiar note of skeptical disdain. "You arrive here making accusations against the headmaster, based on what?" "Your amateur examination of Potter's magical signature." "Amateur?" Bill's voice dropped to a dangerously quiet tone. "I've spent 6 years breaking curses that were created by some of the most sophisticated magical minds in history. I think I know binding magic when I see it." "Severus," Dumbledore said quietly, "perhaps it would be beneficial for us to hear Mr. Weasley's concerns before we dismiss them." Bill pulled out a folder of documents that Harry recognized from Percy's ministry research. 18 binding spells have been placed on Harry's magical core, most likely when he was an infant. These bindings have controlled every aspect of his magical development for the past 14 years. McGonagall's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. 18 binding spells? That's unconscionable. It's also highly illegal, Bill continued, unless it was authorized by someone with Chief Warlock emergency powers. Someone like Professor Dumbledore. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes moving between Bill's face and Harry's. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Harry had never heard before. The binding spells were placed with the utmost care and consideration for Harry's welfare, he said simply. They were necessary to protect both Harry and the magical community from forces beyond a child's ability to control. Harry felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. After weeks of hoping that Dumbledore might have been innocent, might have been manipulated or deceived by someone else, the headmaster had just confirmed his direct involvement. "Protect me from what?" Harry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dumbledore turned his attention to Harry, and for the first time in their acquaintance, his expression was not one of benevolent concern, but of careful calculation. "From the fragment of Tom Riddle's soul that was inadvertently transferred to you the night your parents died," Dumbledore replied. "The bindings have prevented that fragment from influencing your magical development or accessing your magical abilities." "By controlling every spell I've ever cast," Harry said, anger beginning to build in his voice. "By making sure I never had any real choice about my own magic. By ensuring that you developed sufficient magical control to contain something that would otherwise have driven you mad by your 11th birthday," Dumbledore corrected gently. Bill stepped forward, his professional demeanor reasserting itself. "Professor, with respect, the binding patterns we've identified are not designed for containment. They're designed for enhancement and conditioning. You haven't been protecting Harry from Voldemort's influence. You've been preparing him to use it." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. McGonagall had gone very pale, and even Snape looked disturbed by the suggestion. "Enhancement?" McGonagall's voice was very quiet. "Albus, what does Mr. Weasley mean by enhancement?" "During the second task," Bill continued, "Harry demonstrated magical abilities far beyond those of a normal fourth-year student. He cast advanced spells with power levels that should have been impossible for someone his age. The bindings didn't limit his magic. They amplified it. Because the task required him to access his full potential," Dumbledore said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "The tournament was designed to provide a controlled environment for Harry to safely experience his true magical capabilities." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You entered me in the tournament. I arranged for your name to emerge from the goblet of fire. Yes," Dumbledore confirmed. "It was necessary for you to understand the scope of your abilities before the final confrontation with Voldemort." "You've been planning this for years," Harry said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "My whole life, every decision about where I lived and how I was raised, you've been preparing me to fight Voldemort." "I've been preparing you to survive your encounter with Voldemort," Dumbledore corrected. "The prophecy made it clear that one of you must die. I simply ensured that it would not be you." Snape moved from his position near the bookshelves, his black eyes fixed on Harry with an expression of something that might have been sympathy. "You told the boy nothing of this." Harry was not ready to understand the full scope of his situation, Dumbledore replied. "Childhood is a precious thing. I saw no reason to burden him with knowledge of his fate until it became absolutely necessary." "So you decided to control his entire magical development instead," Bill said, his voice sharp with anger. "To turn him into a weapon without his knowledge or consent. I decided to ensure that he would have the power necessary to fulfill his destiny when the time came," Dumbledore said firmly. "The alternative was to watch him die at Voldemort's hands." McGonagall was staring at her long-time colleague with an expression of growing horror. "Albus, what you're describing sounds dangerously close to the kind of magical conditioning that was outlawed after Grindelwald's War." "The circumstances were extraordinary," Dumbledore replied. "Extraordinary measures were required." Harry found himself thinking about all the times he'd felt grateful for Dumbledore's guidance, all the moments when he'd felt protected by the headmaster's presence. Every instance of that protection had been built on manipulation and control, designed to shape him into something he'd never agreed to become. "What happens now?" Harry asked quietly. "Now you prepare for the third task," Dumbledore said. "The final stage of your conditioning will be completed, and you will be ready to face Tom Riddle as an equal." "And if I refuse?" Harry asked. Dumbledore's expression grew sad, but his voice remained resolute. "Then you will die when Voldemort returns, and the wizarding world will fall to darkness. The prophecy cannot be changed, Harry. You were born for this purpose." Bill stepped closer to Harry, his presence solid and protective. "There might be another option. If we can remove the bindings safely, Harry could make his own choices about how to face Voldemort." "Removing the bindings would kill him," Snape said bluntly. "The soul fragment would overwhelm his consciousness within hours." "Or," Bill countered, "it would free him from both Voldemort's influence and Dumbledore's control. Allow him to develop his own magical identity instead of the one that's been imposed on him." Harry looked around the room at the faces of the adults who had shaped his life. Dumbledore's determined benevolence, Snape's reluctant concern, McGonagall's growing dismay, and Bill's protective anger. For the first time in his life, he understood that he was surrounded by people who claimed to have his best interests at heart, while making decisions that treated him as a means to an end, rather than a person with his own rights. "I want the bindings removed," he said quietly. "Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice heavy with warning, "you don't understand the risks. I understand that you've controlled my entire life without my permission," Harry interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "I understand that you've treated me like a weapon to be forged, rather than a person to be protected. And I understand that I'd rather die as myself than live as someone else's creation." The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the various magical devices that lined Dumbledore's shelves. When Bill spoke, his voice was firm with professional confidence. "I'll do everything in my power to remove them safely," he said. "But Harry's right. He deserves the chance to be his own person, whatever the risks." Looking at the determination in Bill's scarred hands and the protective fury in his eyes, Harry felt something that might have been hope. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by someone who valued his autonomy more than his usefulness, even if that someone wasn't the person he'd trusted most. The discovery came 3 days before the third task, when Mad-Eye Moody made the mistake of asking Harry too many detailed questions about his binding removal preparations. Bill had been working with Harry for weeks, carefully analyzing each layer of the magical constraints, but they'd kept their progress secret from everyone except Ron, Hermione, and the Weasley family. Moody shouldn't have known anything about it. Interesting work, this binding analysis, Moody said, during what was supposed to be a routine defense against the dark arts lesson. His magical eye spun wildly as he spoke, but his normal eye was fixed on Harry with unsettling intensity. Takes a particular kind of expertise to unravel something that complex. Harry felt every muscle in his body tense. I don't know what you mean, Professor. Come now, Potter, Moody said with his familiar growling laugh. No point in pretending. Been watching your magical signature for months now. Very interesting changes since your brother started poking around with his curse-breaking tools. The casual mention of Bill sent ice through Harry's veins. They'd been so careful to keep their meetings secret, using unused classrooms and arranging cover stories for Bill's visits. If Moody knew about the binding removal attempts, then someone had been monitoring them far more closely than they'd realized. I think you're mistaken, Professor, Harry said carefully. Am I? Moody's scarred face split into a grin that looked more predatory than friendly. 18 binding spells, if I'm not mistaken. Quite an elaborate piece of work. The kind of magical architecture that takes years to design and implement properly. Harry's blood turned to ice. The exact number of bindings wasn't something they'd shared with anyone outside their inner circle. Even Dumbledore didn't know they'd counted them so precisely. There was no way Moody could know that detail unless— You're not Mad-Eye Moody, Harry said quietly. Very good, Potter, the man wearing Moody's face replied, though it did take you rather longer to figure out than I expected. I'd been wondering if the binding spells were affecting your mental acuity as well as your magical development. Harry's hand moved instinctively toward his wand, but stopped when he realized that whoever this was had been teaching defense against the dark arts for months. If they wanted to hurt him, they'd had countless opportunities already. Who are you? He asked instead. Someone who's been very interested in your magical conditioning, the false Moody replied. Someone who helped design those binding spells you're so eager to remove. The implications hit Harry like a physical blow. You work for Voldemort. I work for Lord Voldemort. Yes, the man confirmed. Though my master's relationship with your situation is more complex than you might imagine. What do you mean? The binding spells weren't placed on you to protect you from the Dark Lord's influence, the false Moody explained, his magical eye continuing its wild rotation. They were placed on you to ensure you'd survive long enough to serve a very specific purpose. Harry felt the room spinning around him. What purpose? To provide Lord Voldemort with a properly conditioned vessel when the time came for his return, the man said simply. Your body has been prepared since infancy to host his consciousness. The binding spells have shaped your magical core to be compatible with his power signature. The words hit Harry like a curse, driving the breath from his lungs and making his scar flare with sudden pain. Everything they'd discovered about the bindings, every theory they'd developed about magical conditioning and combat preparation, all of it had been wrong. The bindings weren't meant to turn him into a weapon to fight Voldemort. They were meant to turn him into a suitable host for Voldemort's consciousness. That's impossible, Harry said weakly. Is it? The false Moody circled around Harry's desk, like a predator stalking prey. You carry a fragment of the Dark Lord's soul already. The binding spells have been gradually integrating that fragment into your magical core, preparing your body to accept a much larger spiritual transfer. The soul fragment in my scar was the key to the entire process, the man confirmed. A magical anchor that allowed the binding spells to reshape your spiritual architecture from the inside. Very elegant work, really. Took years of planning and careful implementation. Harry's mind raced, trying to process the implications. Dumbledore knew. He knew what the bindings were really for. Professor Dumbledore believed he was protecting you, the false Moody replied. He thought the binding spells were designed to contain the soul fragment and prevent it from influencing your development. He never realized that they were actually designed to facilitate a much more complete spiritual possession. So you've been lying to him too. I've been providing him with exactly the information he needed to make the decisions we wanted him to make, the man corrected. The good professor is remarkably predictable when he believes he's acting in someone's best interests. Harry felt sick. How long have you been planning this? Since before you were born, the false Moody said. The prophecy made it clear that you would be the key to the Dark Lord's ultimate victory. We simply needed to ensure that victory took the proper form. The prophecy said one of us had to die. The prophecy said one of you had to die, the man agreed. It never specified which consciousness would survive the encounter. The full scope of the manipulation was beginning to dawn on Harry. His entire life, every decision about his upbringing and magical education had been orchestrated to prepare him for spiritual possession. The Dursleys' cruelty, Dumbledore's protective distance, even the discovery of the bindings, all of it had been designed to shape him into something that Voldemort could inhabit. The third task, Harry said suddenly, will provide the perfect opportunity for the final phase of the conditioning, the false Moody confirmed. The maze has been designed to stress your magical core beyond its normal limits. When you reach the center and touch the Triwizard Cup, the binding spells will complete their integration process. And then Lord Voldemort will have a properly prepared 17-year-old body with access to magical power that has been carefully cultivated for over a decade, the man said with obvious satisfaction. Your physical form, but his consciousness controlling it. Immortality through possession rather than through Horcruxes. Harry stared at the man wearing Mad-Eye Moody's face and felt a cold determination settle in his chest. What's your name? Bartemius Crouch, Jr., the man replied, though I doubt the name means anything to you. You're wrong about that, Harry said quietly. Bill's been researching you. We know you escaped from Azkaban. Know you've been using Polyjuice Potion to impersonate Professor Moody. Crouch's expression shifted slightly, the first sign of uncertainty Harry had seen from him. Impossible. The Polyjuice brewing has been perfect. No one could have detected. Bill's a curse breaker, Harry interrupted. He's trained to notice magical signatures that don't match their apparent source. He's known you weren't really Mad-Eye Moody since January. The lie came easily, born from months of learning, that information was a weapon, and that the truth could be more dangerous than deception. Crouch didn't need to know that they'd only just figured out his identity. He just needed to believe that his cover had been blown months ago. If they knew, why didn't they expose me? Crouch asked, his confidence visibly shaken. Because we wanted to know who you were working for and what you were planning, Harry said, his voice growing stronger with each word. Because stopping one Death Eater isn't enough when there's a larger conspiracy at work. You're lying. Am I? Harry echoed Crouch's earlier words back at him. Bill's been documenting everything. Your magical signature, your behavioral patterns, even samples of the Polyjuice Potion you've been brewing. We've got enough evidence to send you back to Azkaban for life. Crouch's face had gone pale beneath his scars. Even if that's true, it won't matter after tomorrow night. The third task will proceed as planned, and Lord Voldemort will have his new body. Only if I participate, Harry said, and I think I'll pass. The Goblet of Fire is a magical contract, Harry finished. But magical contracts can be broken if you're willing to pay the price. and I think I'd rather face whatever consequences come from breaking the contract than hand my body over to Voldemort." For the first time since the conversation began, Crouch looked genuinely alarmed. "Potter, you don't understand. If you refuse to complete the tournament, the magical backlash could kill you." "Better to die as myself than live as Voldemort's puppet," Harry replied, echoing words he'd spoken to Dumbledore months earlier. Crouch raised his wand, but Harry was already moving, diving behind a desk as a stunning spell scorched the air where he'd been standing. The classroom door slammed open, and Bill burst through with his own wand drawn, Charlie close behind him. "Harry, get down!" Bill shouted, sending a blasting curse toward Crouch that shattered the blackboard. The battle was brief but intense. 3 experienced adult wizards exchanging spells in the confined space of the classroom, while Harry pressed himself against the floor and tried not to get hit by the crossfire. When the dust settled, Barty Crouch Jr. lay unconscious near the teacher's desk, his disguise finally failing as the polyjuice potion wore off. Harry stared at the pale, thin face that was revealed, a man who looked older than his 32 years, marked by Azkaban and fanatical devotion to a cause that treated human beings as disposable resources. "Well," Bill said grimly, binding Crouch with conjured ropes, "I guess we know what we're dealing with now." Harry nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead to the implications of everything Crouch had revealed. Tomorrow night, the 3rd task would take place as scheduled. Voldemort would be waiting for him to touch a portkey that would complete his spiritual conditioning and deliver him into the Dark Lord's hands. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Harry felt like he understood the rules of the game, and he was ready to change them. The binding removal began at sunset on June 24th in the abandoned classroom on the 7th floor, where Bill had first examined Harry 6 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. While the rest of Hogwarts prepared for the 3rd task's grand finale, Harry was attempting magical surgery that could either free him or kill him. "Last chance to change your mind," Bill said quietly, arranging his diagnostic tools in careful patterns around the chair where Harry sat. "Once we start this process, there's no stopping midway." Harry looked around the room at the faces of the people who had become his true family over the past months. Bill, focused and determined despite the fear in his eyes. Sirius, who had arrived that afternoon, despite the risk to his freedom. Remus, pale but resolute, his werewolf senses attuned to the dangerous magical currents they were about to unleash. Even Dumbledore stood near the door, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like regret. "I'm ready," Harry said, and found that he meant it. The process began with Bill casting detection charms that revealed the full scope of the binding network in 3-dimensional light. 18 threads of magical energy wrapped around Harry's spiritual form, more complex and interconnected than they'd appeared in any previous examination. Some pulsed with the familiar rhythm of monitoring enchantments, while others thrummed with power that felt distinctly alien. "The integration is more advanced than I expected," Bill murmured, studying the projection with professional intensity. "The soul fragment has been woven into at least 6 of the primary binding patterns. Removing them will mean confronting Voldemort's influence directly." "Meaning what, exactly?" Sirius asked from his position near the window, where he could watch for any sign of approaching danger. "Meaning that when we break these bindings, we're going to wake up every piece of Tom Riddle that's been dormant in Harry's consciousness," Remus replied grimly. "The fragment won't go quietly." Harry felt his scar begin to throb with a familiar burning sensation. "It already knows what we're doing." Bill nodded, selecting a curved blade that gleamed with its own inner light. "This is going to hurt, Harry. The bindings are integrated into your magical core. Removing them will feel like tearing parts of yourself away." Do it, Harry said firmly. The first binding came away with a sensation like having a tooth extracted by someone who'd forgotten to use pain-numbing charms. Harry gritted his teeth and gripped the arms of his chair as magical energy that had been constrained for 14 years suddenly flooded through his system. The classroom grew brighter, shadows sharpening as his magical signature intensified. "One down," Bill said, sweat already beading on his forehead. 17 to go. The second binding fought back. As Bill's tools touched the thread of magical energy, it writhed like a living thing, sending bolts of pain through Harry's nervous system that made his vision blur. He could hear Sirius swearing creatively in the background, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. "Harry," Dumbledore's voice cut through the haze of pain. "You must stay conscious. If you lose awareness during the removal process, the backlash could be fatal." Harry forced his eyes to focus on the headmaster's face. "Tell me about the prophecy." "Harry, this isn't the time." "Tell me," Harry insisted, using the conversation as an anchor against the waves of agony washing through him. "All of it. No more lies." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes reflecting the magical light from Bill's tools. "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches," he began, "born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies." Bill removed the third binding, with a sound like tearing silk. Harry's magical aura flared again, and this time he felt something else, a presence that was definitely not his own, stirring angrily in the depths of his consciousness. "And either must die at the hand of the other," Dumbledore continued, "for neither can live while the other survives." "That's why you prepared me as a weapon," Harry said, through gritted teeth, as Bill began work on the fourth binding. "Because you thought one of us had to kill the other." "I thought I was ensuring you would be the one to survive," Dumbledore replied quietly. The fourth binding resisted so violently that Bill had to step back, his hands smoking from magical feedback. "This one's different. It's not just containing power. It's actively connected to something external." "Voldemort," Remus said, grimly. "He's trying to maintain the connection." As if summoned by his name, a voice that was definitely not Harry's spoke from his mouth, cold and high and filled with fury. "You cannot stop what has already been ordained. The boy is mine by right of conquest." Sirius stepped forward, his wand trained on Harry despite the obvious pain it caused him. "Get out of his head, Tom." "I am not in his head," Voldemort's voice replied through Harry's lips. "I am part of his head, part of his soul. You cannot remove me without destroying him entirely." "Watch us," Bill said grimly, and applied his tools to the fourth binding with renewed determination. The removal process became a battle of wills as much as a feat of magical skill. With each binding that Bill destroyed, Voldemort's influence grew stronger, fighting to maintain his hold on Harry's consciousness. But with each binding that disappeared, Harry felt more like himself than he had in years. "The monitoring spells are gone," he gasped after the 8th removal. "I can feel the difference. My magic actually belongs to me now." "Don't celebrate yet," Bill warned, studying the remaining bindings with growing alarm. "The last 10 are the most dangerous. They're the ones that have been actively reshaping your magical core for spiritual possession." "Then let's finish this," Harry said, drawing on reserves of determination he hadn't known he possessed. The 9th binding came away with a sound like breaking glass, and suddenly Harry could sense things he'd never felt before. The magical signatures of everyone in the room, the ley lines running beneath Hogwarts, even the approaching presence of someone who definitely shouldn't be anywhere near the castle. "He's coming," Harry said suddenly. "Voldemort. He's almost here." "How can you possibly know that?" Dumbledore asked sharply. "Because without the monitoring spells interfering, I can sense his magical signature," Harry replied, "and he's furious." Bill worked faster, his curse-breaking tools moving with desperate precision as he attacked the remaining bindings. Each removal sent shockwaves through the castle's magical defenses, and Harry could feel Hogwarts itself responding to his newly unleashed power. The 15th binding fought so hard that removing it threw Bill backward into the wall. When Sirius helped him to his feet, the Cursebreaker's hands were shaking. "I can't do this alone," Bill said. "The last 3 bindings are too integrated. They're connected to Harry's life force itself." "Then we help," Remus said simply, drawing his wand. "And me," Sirius added, moving to Bill's other side. "This is madness," Dumbledore protested. "If you make a mistake, you'll kill him." "If we don't try, Voldemort will possess him," Bill replied. "I know which option I prefer." The joint casting required more magical coordination than Harry had ever witnessed. Bill's expertise, Sirius's raw power, and Remus's careful precision worked together like instruments in an orchestra, each supporting the others as they attacked the final bindings simultaneously. The 16th binding snapped with a sound like thunder, and Harry felt something fundamental shift in his magical core. Power that had been artificially constrained for 14 years suddenly rushed through him like a dam bursting, and for a moment he thought he might lose consciousness from the sheer intensity of sensation. The 17th binding resisted until the last moment, then gave way so suddenly that all 3 men stumbled. Harry's magical signature blazed so brightly that the detection spells couldn't track it anymore. He had become a source of magical energy, so powerful that normal diagnostic tools were overwhelmed. "One left," Bill said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. The 18th binding was different from all the others. Instead of fighting their attempts to remove it, it seemed to welcome the tools, drawing them deeper into Harry's spiritual architecture. Only when it was too late did Bill realize what was happening. "It's not a binding," he said with growing horror. "It's a gateway." The final thread of magical energy dissolved, and Lord Voldemort stepped through the opening it left behind, not physically, but spiritually, his consciousness flowing into Harry's body like water into a broken container. For a moment, Harry felt his sense of self wavering, pushed aside by a will that was colder and more ruthless than anything he'd ever encountered. Voldemort's memories flooded through him. Decades of murder and manipulation, a lifetime spent in pursuit of power at any cost. But then Harry remembered who he was. Not the weapon Dumbledore had tried to forge, not the vessel Voldemort had tried to claim, but Harry Potter, son of James and Lily, brother to the Weasleys in all but blood. Someone who had chosen love over power and freedom over safety. His own magical signature, finally unchained from 14 years of artificial control, blazed through his spiritual architecture like fire through dry grass. The power wasn't enhanced or modified or shaped by anyone else's design. It was purely, completely his own. Voldemort's consciousness recoiled from the contact, unable to maintain its grip on someone whose magical identity was so fundamentally opposed to everything the Dark Lord represented. With a sound like breaking chains, Tom Riddle's spiritual presence was expelled from Harry's body, leaving behind only empty echoes and the faint smell of something burning. Harry opened eyes he didn't remember closing and found himself surrounded by the concerned faces of his chosen family. Bill was examining him with professional thoroughness. Sirius was gripping his shoulder as though afraid he might disappear, and Remus was studying his magical signature with visible relief. "How do you feel?" Bill asked. Harry took a careful inventory of his magical core, marveling at the clean flow of power that no longer carried any trace of foreign influence. For the first time in his life, his magic felt entirely his own. "Free," he said simply. Outside the window, the sounds of the third task continued. Students cheering, officials announcing updates, the normal celebration of a tournament that no longer had anything to do with Harry's fate. He was no longer bound by magical contracts or prophecies or anyone else's expectations. He was just Harry Potter, surrounded by people who loved him for who he was, rather than what he could become. And that, Harry thought, as he felt his friend's protective presence around him, was more than enough. The war with Voldemort would come eventually, but it would be fought on Harry's terms, with Harry's choices using magic that belonged completely to him. Whatever happened next, he would face it as himself, for the first time in his life.